Sure. Let's dive into your YouTube video introduction with a heartfelt and compelling tone. The Christmas lights flickered softly, casting a warm glow across the snow-covered street. It was a scene straight out of a holiday postcard, families bundled up, children laughing as they played in the snow, and the faint sound of carolers in the distance. Yet, amidst the joy and cheer of the season, there was one corner of the bustling town square that seemed strangely still. Near the giant Christmas tree, a girl no older than 9 sat on the cold bench, her shoulders hunched and trembling. She wore a thin jacket that did little to shield her from the biting winter air. Her tiny hands clutched a crumpled note, her dark curls bouncing slightly as she sobbed quietly into her knees. To anyone passing by, she might have seemed like just another child out too late on a chilly December evening. But for those who stopped to look closer, there was something haunting about the loneliness in her eyes. Her name was Amara. She had wandered to the town square after the bustling streets and glowing lights became too overwhelming to ignore. Somewhere deep inside her, she hoped to find the magic she had heard about in stories, a magic that promised warmth, love, and belonging. But instead, as she sat there under the towering tree, she felt more lost than ever. Across the square, a couple was walking hand in hand, their laughter blending with the holiday buzz around them. Jessica and Mike had always made it a point to visit the Christmas tree lighting ceremony every year. It was their way of starting the season with a bit of magic and giving back to the community. Jessica, with her warm smile and compassionate heart, noticed Amara first. "Mike," she whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "That little girl, she's all alone. And it's freezing out here." Mike followed her gaze, his expression softening immediately. They exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. Jessica's heart had always been drawn to helping others, and Mike never hesitated to follow her lead. As they approached the bench, they could see Amara quickly wiping her tears, trying to appear less vulnerable. "Hi there," Jessica said gently, crouching to Amara's level. "Are you okay, sweetheart? Are you waiting for someone?" Amara hesitated, clutching the note tighter. Her big, tear-filled eyes darted between Jessica and Mike, uncertain whether she could trust them. She had learned early on that trust was a fragile thing, easily broken. I don't know where to go," she mumbled, her voice barely audible over the chatter around them. Jessica's heart ached at the sight of her. "It's all right," she said softly. "We're not here to hurt you. Can you tell us your name?" "Amara," the girl whispered. Mike sat down on the bench beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Amara, that's a beautiful name," he said warmly. "Do you live around here?" Amara shook her head, her curls bouncing slightly. She looked down at the note in her hands, then up at the Christmas tree, as if searching for an answer. Jessica noticed the paper and gently asked, "What's that you're holding, sweetie?" Amara hesitated for a moment before holding it out to Jessica. The note was wrinkled and smudged, but its message was clear, asterisk to whoever finds me, please take care of me. Asterisk Jessica's breath caught in her throat as she read the words. She glanced at Mike, her eyes wide with concern. "Oh, Mike," she murmured, her voice breaking slightly. Mike leaned in to read the note, his jaw tightening as he tried to process what they had just stumbled upon. "Amara," he said gently, "where are your parents? Do they know you're here?" Amara's eyes filled with fresh tears, and she shook her head again. "They're gone," she said simply. Jessica felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to wrap Amara in her arms and tell her everything would be all right, but she knew she needed to tread carefully. "Gone where, sweetie?" Amara hesitated, her small hands trembling as she tried to explain. They just left me. They said someone else would take care of me. But no one did." Jessica and Mike exchanged a look of shock and sorrow. The festive atmosphere around them seemed to fade, the joyous carols and laughter replaced by the weight of the moment. Jessica reached out to place a comforting hand on Amara's shoulder. "Amara," she said softly, "you're not alone anymore. We're here, and we're going to help you." But as the words left her lips, Jessica couldn't shake the sense of urgency bubbling in her chest. Who had left Amara here? And why? The answers were out there, somewhere in the cold December night, waiting to unravel a story more heartbreaking and more hopeful than they could ever imagine. Amara's lips quivered as she looked up at Jessica, her teary eyes flickering with a glimmer of hope. She wasn't used to people staying, to people caring. Yet something about Jessica's soothing voice and Mike's reassuring presence felt different. Still, the heaviness in her chest made it hard to believe. "Do you mean it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jessica's heart clenched. She crouched closer, her voice firm yet gentle. "Absolutely. You're not alone in this, Amara. We'll figure this out together." Mike nodded, leaning in slightly to add, "And we won't rush you. You can tell us everything when you're ready. But for now, let's get you somewhere warm. It's too cold to sit out here." Amara hesitated. Trust didn't come easily when life had taught her otherwise. But her fingers, numb from the icy air, and the emptiness in her stomach convinced her to stand, clutching the note tightly. She glanced back at the towering Christmas tree, its twinkling lights reflecting in her tear-streaked cheeks, before nodding reluctantly. Jessica smiled softly and held out her hand. "Let's go. We'll start with some hot chocolate. How does that sound?" Amara blinked, as if trying to process the kindness in Jessica's voice. "I like hot chocolate," she murmured. "Good," Jessica said, her tone light as she tried to keep the mood hopeful. "I know a little cafe just around the corner. They make the best hot chocolate, with whipped cream and sprinkles. What do you say?" For the first time that evening, a faint smile tugged at Amara's lips, though it was fleeting. She nodded again, her small hand finally slipping into Jessica's. The trio walked quietly through the bustling square, weaving between couples holding hands and children tugging on their parents' coats, begging for another ride on the carousel. Jessica and Mike exchanged glances as they tried to piece together Amara's story from her few words and the note she carried. Inside the cafe, the warmth was a welcome change. The scent of cinnamon and freshly baked cookies filled the air, and the soft hum of holiday music made the space feel cozy. Jessica guided Amara to a small booth near the window, while Mike went to place the order. Amara sat silently, her gaze fixed on the Christmas lights outside. Jessica watched her closely, wondering what this brave little girl had been through. "Amara," she said softly, "how long have you been out here?" Amara shrugged, her eyes still on the twinkling lights. "A while," she replied vaguely. Jessica wanted to press further but decided against it. Instead, she tried a different approach. "Do you like Christmas?" Amara turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I used to," she said after a long pause. "When I was little." Jessica's chest tightened at the words. Before she could respond, Mike returned with 3 steaming mugs of hot chocolate, each topped with a swirl of whipped cream and colorful sprinkles. "Here we go," he said, sliding one in front of Amara. Amara stared at the mug for a moment before wrapping her hands around it, letting the warmth seep into her frozen fingers. She took a cautious sip, her eyes widening slightly at the taste. "It's good," she said quietly. Mike grinned. "Told you. Best in town." The couple let Amara drink in silence, giving her the space she seemed to need. Slowly but surely, her guarded demeanor began to soften. She started sharing little details, about how she had been staying in a shelter until it closed down, about how she wandered from place to place, hoping to find someone who cared. Jessica and Mike listened intently, their hearts breaking with each word. They didn't push her for too much, knowing that trust was a fragile thing. But one thing was clear, they couldn't let her face this alone. "Amara," Jessica said after a while, "do you have anyone we can call? Maybe a relative, a friend?" Amara shook her head, her fingers tightening around the mug. "No one," she whispered. Jessica reached out and gently placed her hand over Amara's. "Then we'll be your someone," she said firmly. Amara looked up, her eyes searching Jessica's face for any sign of insincerity. But all she found was warmth and determination. For the first time in a long time, she felt a tiny spark of hope. Before they could continue, the sound of the cafe door swinging open caught their attention. A woman in a worn coat stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room with a frantic expression. When her gaze landed on Amara, her face crumpled with relief. "Amara!" the woman cried, rushing toward their table. Amara froze, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and surprise. Jessica and Mike exchanged wary glances as the woman approached. Who is she? And why did Amara look so frightened? The woman stopped at the edge of the booth, her voice trembling. "Amara, I've been looking everywhere for you. I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Amara shrank back, clutching the edge of the table. Jessica instinctively placed a protective arm around her. "Who are you?" she asked firmly, her tone calm but cautious. "I'm her aunt," the woman said quickly, her eyes filling with tears. "Her mom, my sister, left her with me, but things got hard. I didn't mean to lose her. Please, I just want to take her home." Jessica's mind raced. Was this woman telling the truth? Could she be trusted? She glanced at Mike, who seemed just as uncertain. Amara's voice broke the tense silence. "You said you didn't want me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You told me to go." The woman's face crumpled further, and she fell to her knees beside the booth. "I didn't mean it, Amara. I was scared and overwhelmed. But I promise, I'll do better. Please, give me another chance." Jessica and Mike exchanged a long look. This wasn't just about deciding whether to trust the woman, it was about doing what was best for Amara. And as they sat there, the weight of the decision pressed down on them. Would Amara finally find the family she deserved? Or was there more to this story than met the eye? Amara's small hands trembled as she clutched her hot chocolate. Her wide eyes darted between Jessica, Mike, and the woman claiming to be her aunt. The air in the cafe grew heavy, the cheerful holiday music now a sharp contrast to the tension at their table. Jessica kept her arm around Amara, her instincts screaming to protect this fragile child. "Amara," she said softly, crouching slightly to meet the girl's eye level, "do you recognize her? Is she really your aunt?" Amara hesitated, her throat tightening as she tried to find the words. She's my mom's sister," she admitted, barely above a whisper. But, her voice faltered, and she glanced down at the table, her eyes filling with tears again. Jessica's heart ached at the sight. She glanced at the woman, who was still kneeling on the floor, her hands clasped together in a desperate plea. There was something about her disheveled appearance and shaky voice that hinted at both guilt and sincerity. But trust couldn't be given so easily, not when it came to a child's safety. "Amara says you told her to leave," Jessica said, her tone careful but firm. "Why would you do that?" The woman wiped at her face, her tears leaving streaks on her cheeks. "I didn't mean it," she said, her voice cracking. "I wasn't thinking straight. My husband left, the bills piled up, and I couldn't see a way out. But I never stopped looking for her. I swear to you, I've been searching everywhere." Mike crossed his arms, his usually calm demeanor now tinged with suspicion. "If you've been looking for her, why didn't you report her missing? Why is she sitting out here in the cold instead of being safe with you?" The woman flinched at his words. I didn't think anyone would help, she admitted. I thought I'd get in trouble. But that doesn't mean I don't care. I love her. She's my family. Amara finally looked up, her voice trembling as she spoke. You didn't come for me when I needed you. I waited, for days. You told me to leave because you couldn't handle me. You said I was too much. Jessica's grip on Amara's shoulder tightened protectively. Every word felt like a knife, cutting through the fragile trust this little girl had left in her heart. The woman broke into sobs, shaking her head as she tried to explain. I was wrong, Amara. I made a terrible mistake. But I promise I'll make it right. Just come home with me, and I'll show you. Please, give me one more chance. Amara's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were different. They weren't just tears of sadness, they were tears of confusion, of mistrust. She shook her head slowly, pulling away from the table. I don't know if I can, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jessica glanced at Mike again, her thoughts spinning as she tried to process everything. She knew they couldn't make this decision for Amara, but the child needed time and space to think clearly. The emotional weight of the moment was too much for anyone, let alone a young girl who had been through so much. We need to figure this out properly, Jessica said, addressing the woman. Rushing things won't help anyone. Amara needs to feel safe, and that's our priority right now. The woman opened her mouth to protest, but Jessica raised a hand gently to stop her. Let's take a step back and do this the right way. We can involve someone who can help, maybe a social worker or someone who knows how to handle these situations. But right now, Amara needs time. The woman looked like she wanted to argue, but the determination in Jessica's voice left no room for debate. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Okay, she said quietly. But please, don't shut me out completely. She's all I have left. Jessica gave a small nod, though her guard remained up. We'll figure something out, she said cautiously. Amara stayed silent, her eyes fixed on her mug as if it held all the answers she needed. She didn't look at her aunt, and she didn't speak again until the woman reluctantly left the cafe. Even then, her voice was barely a whisper. I don't want to go back to her. Not yet. Jessica reached out and gently stroked Amara's hair. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, she said softly. We'll make sure you're okay first. Mike sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he leaned back in his seat. This is a lot, he admitted, glancing between Jessica and Amara. But we'll handle it. Together. Amara looked up at them, her tear-streaked face a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Why are you helping me? She asked quietly. Jessica smiled gently. Because everyone deserves someone who cares, she said simply. And right now, we care about you. For the first time, Amara's lips quirked into the faintest hint of a smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The trio sat in the cafe for a while longer, letting the warmth and quiet calm them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in a peaceful stillness. But inside their little corner of the world, the storm of emotions was far from over. Jessica and Mike knew they couldn't solve everything in one night. But as they walked out of the cafe with Amara between them, they silently vowed to do whatever it took to help her find the family she truly deserved, whether it was her aunt or someone else who could give her the love and stability she so desperately needed. And as the Christmas lights flickered around them, Amara clutched the crumpled note in her pocket, wondering if this was the start of a new chapter, or just another page in a story filled with unanswered questions. The walk back to Jessica and Mike's apartment was quiet, save for the soft crunch of snow under their boots. Amara held tightly to Jessica's hand, her small fingers curled around the warmth and comfort it offered. The city lights reflected in her eyes, but her gaze remained distant, her thoughts locked in a place far beyond the festive streets. Jessica glanced down at the girl, wondering what kind of thoughts were running through her mind. She didn't push, though. Amara had been through enough tonight, and the last thing she wanted was to overwhelm her. Mike, walking on Amara's other side, caught Jessica's eye and gave her a reassuring nod. They didn't need words to communicate, they were in this together. Once inside the apartment, the familiar coziness of their home seemed to wrap around them like a warm blanket. The small Christmas tree in the corner twinkled softly, and the faint scent of pine filled the air. Amara hesitated in the doorway, her eyes scanning the space as if she were afraid to step too far in. "Make yourself at home," Jessica said gently, giving Amara's hand a small squeeze. "This is your space too, okay? For as long as you need." Amara nodded hesitantly, slipping off her shoes and shuffling toward the couch. She sat down carefully, her posture stiff as if she didn't quite believe she belonged there. Mike disappeared into the kitchen, and moments later, the comforting sound of mugs clinking and a kettle whistling filled the air. Jessica sat down beside Amara, keeping a bit of space between them to avoid overwhelming her. "Do you like hot chocolate?" Jessica asked softly. Amara nodded again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, thank you." Jessica smiled, though her heart ached at the polite, almost formal way Amara spoke. It was as if the girl was trying not to take up too much space, not to cause any trouble. Mike returned with 3 steaming mugs, setting one down in front of Amara. "Careful, it's hot," he said with a gentle smile. "But I made it extra chocolatey, just the way I like it." Amara gave a small, almost shy smile in return, her fingers wrapping around the mug for warmth. She took a tentative sip, the sweetness seeming to melt a little of the tension from her face. For a while, the 3 of them sat in silence, the hum of the heater and the twinkling of Christmas lights filling the room with a quiet sense of calm. Jessica and Mike didn't push Amara to talk, knowing she would open up when she was ready. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Amara spoke. "I used to love Christmas," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the tree. "But it's been different these last few years." Jessica exchanged a glance with Mike before turning her attention back to Amara. "What changed?" she asked gently. Amara's fingers tightened around her mug, her gaze distant. "After my mom died, everything felt wrong. My aunt tried, I think, but it was never the same. And then, she got tired of me." Jessica's chest tightened at the words, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm so sorry, Amara," she said softly. "That must have been so hard for you." Amara nodded, her lower lip trembling. "I thought maybe if I stayed out of the way, she'd love me again. But no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. And then she told me to leave, and I didn't know where to go. I didn't want to be a burden anymore." Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes, and she reached out to place a hand over Amara's. "You're not a burden," she said firmly. "You're a wonderful, kind, brave girl. And you deserve to be loved and cared for always." Amara looked up at her, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Do you really think so?" Jessica nodded, her voice steady. "I know so. And Mike and I are here for you, no matter what. You don't have to go through this alone anymore." Mike chimed in, his tone gentle but resolute. "She's right, Amara. We're going to figure this out together. You have a whole future ahead of you, and we're going to make sure it's a bright one." For the first time that night, a real smile broke through Amara's guarded expression. It was small and fleeting, but it was enough to fill the room with a sense of hope. As the evening stretched on, Jessica and Mike helped Amara settle in, giving her a pair of fuzzy pajamas and tucking her into the guest bed. She clutched the soft blankets tightly, her tiny frame almost disappearing beneath them. "Good night, Amara," Jessica said softly, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's face. "Good night," Amara whispered, her voice tinged with something that sounded almost like gratitude. As Jessica and Mike closed the door behind them, they stood in the hallway, the weight of the evening settling over them. "She's been through so much," Jessica said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Mike nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah. But we'll do whatever it takes to help her. No kid should have to go through this alone." Jessica leaned against him, her heart heavy but filled with determination. They didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, they weren't giving up on Amara. Not now, not ever. And as the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the city in a quiet stillness, it felt as though the first seeds of something new and beautiful were being planted, a family, pieced together by love and hope, finding their way forward one step at a time. The days that followed were a whirlwind of small, quiet moments that seemed to stretch endlessly, each one revealing more about Amara and the fragile walls she had built around herself. Jessica noticed how she flinched at sudden movements, how she would pause in the middle of speaking as though weighing every word, afraid of saying the wrong thing. At first, it was little things, like how she always cleaned up after herself, carefully folding the blankets on the couch or rinsing out her mug. It was as though she was trying to prove she was worth keeping around, even in the smallest ways. Jessica and Mike didn't push her, but they made sure she knew she was welcome. Jessica would leave a plate of cookies on the counter, a silent invitation for Amara to take one if she wanted. Mike would casually invite her to join him when he was setting up the Christmas lights outside, handing her a string of twinkling bulbs and smiling when she hesitantly began helping. Bit by bit, Amara started to open up. She talked about her mom, how she used to bake the most amazing gingerbread cookies every Christmas and how they would spend hours decorating them together. Her eyes would light up when she spoke, but the light would fade just as quickly when she remembered those days were gone. Jessica listened intently, her heart breaking a little more with every story. She knew they couldn't replace what Amara had lost, but she and Mike were determined to create new memories with her, ones that would make her feel safe and loved again. But the peace they were trying to create was fragile, and the cracks began to show when a knock came at the door one evening. Jessica opened it to find a stern-looking woman standing on the porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I'm Linda, Amara's aunt," the woman said curtly, her gaze darting past Jessica and into the apartment. "I've been looking for her." Jessica's stomach tightened, and she instinctively stepped in front of the doorway, blocking Linda's view. "Amara is here," she said carefully. "But she's been through a lot, and she needs time." Linda scoffed, her expression hard. "She's my responsibility. I've already spoken to the authorities. You can't just keep her here." Jessica's heart raced as she struggled to keep her voice calm. "With all due respect, it doesn't seem like you've been much of a support for her." "That's none of your business," Linda snapped. "She's my niece, and I'm taking her back." Amara appeared in the hallway, her eyes wide with fear. She clutched the edge of the wall, her body trembling. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to go back." Jessica turned to her, her chest tightening at the raw fear in the girl's eyes. "Amara," she said softly, crouching down to her level. "You're safe here. No one is going to make you do anything you don't want to do." Linda's face darkened, but before she could say anything else, Mike stepped forward. "I think it's best if we have this conversation with someone who can help mediate," he said firmly. "Let's involve the right people to make sure Amara's needs are the priority." The tension hung heavy in the air, but Linda eventually huffed and turned away, muttering something under her breath before storming off. Amara sank to the floor as soon as the door closed, tears streaming down her face. Jessica rushed to her side, wrapping her arms around the girl and holding her tightly. "It's okay," she whispered, her own voice trembling. "You're not going anywhere you don't want to go. I promise." In the days that followed, Jessica and Mike reached out to social services, determined to do everything by the book. They wanted to ensure Amara's safety and well-being while protecting her from being forced back into an environment where she felt unloved and unwanted. But the process wasn't easy. There were forms to fill out, interviews to attend, and countless questions that seemed designed to pick apart every aspect of their lives. Jessica could see the strain it put on Amara, who grew quieter and more withdrawn with each passing day. One night, as Jessica was tucking Amara into bed, the girl finally spoke. "Do you think they'll let me stay?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Jessica's throat tightened, and she forced herself to smile. "We're doing everything we can to make sure you're safe and happy," she said. "No matter what happens, you have us on your side." Amara nodded, but the doubt lingered in her eyes. Meanwhile, Mike had been digging deeper into Amara's background, trying to understand why Linda was so insistent on taking her back. What he discovered left him shaken: financial troubles, legal issues, and a pattern of neglect that painted a troubling picture. "We have to fight this," he told Jessica one evening, his voice resolute. "Amara deserves better than being stuck in a situation like that." Jessica agreed, but the fight was far from over. Linda wasn't giving up easily, and the legal system was slow and often unkind. The uncertainty weighed heavily on all of them, but through it all, Jessica and Mike made sure Amara knew she was loved. They spent their evenings decorating cookies, watching Christmas movies, and building a gingerbread house that leaned precariously to one side but was perfect in its imperfection. And slowly, amidst the uncertainty and fear, Amara began to smile again. It was a fragile, tentative thing, but it was there, a glimmer of hope in the midst of the storm. But the storm was far from over, and Jessica and Mike knew they had to stay strong for Amara. There were still battles to be fought, and the outcome was anything but certain. The days dragged on, each one feeling like a battle in itself. Every morning, Jessica and Mike woke up with a quiet determination, but as the evening came, the weight of uncertainty settled in their bones. Amara, too, was a puzzle that they were still trying to piece together. She would laugh at a joke or smile over a shared story, but the shadows in her eyes never quite faded. Amara had started spending more time with Mike in the mornings, helping him in the small garden they kept on the balcony. Mike found that the act of planting seeds and watching them grow gave them both a sense of control, something they could rely on in an otherwise chaotic situation. Amara had a knack for it, her delicate fingers working gently as she helped him plant the new batch of winter flowers. "I used to help my mom with the garden," Amara said one morning as they worked side by side, her voice steady but soft. "She had the most beautiful roses. I tried to make them grow like she did, but I could never get it just right." Mike smiled, though it was bittersweet. "Maybe the roses are just waiting for you to get the hang of it. You can't rush a flower." Amara didn't respond, but the way her lips twitched upward showed that the words had landed somewhere inside her. But the quiet peace of their mornings was broken one afternoon when Jessica received a call from the social worker who had been assigned to Amara's case. The conversation was short, but the message was clear: the situation with Linda was escalating. "I'm sorry, Jessica, but we might need to make a move sooner than we expected. It looks like the court will be getting involved. We need to be prepared for a hearing." Jessica's stomach dropped at the words. A hearing? That meant more legal red tape, more paperwork, and more questions that Amara wasn't ready to answer. She hung up the phone and stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. Mike, sensing something was wrong, entered the room. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. "It's getting worse," Jessica said, her voice tight. "The court's getting involved. We'll have to fight for Amara, for her safety. And she's not ready for that. She's so scared, Mike." He didn't answer at first, but his face hardened as he stepped closer to her. "Then we fight. We fight for her." Jessica nodded, her heart heavy. But it's not just about the court. It's about her heart. She's been through so much, and I'm worried she's not ready to face what's coming. The tension between them was palpable. They both knew what they were up against. They were fighting against a system that didn't always prioritize the best interests of a child, fighting against Linda's desperation, and fighting against the emotional toll it was taking on Amara. Meanwhile, Amara was retreating further into herself, her already fragile shell cracking under the pressure. The legal battles, the constant reminders of her past, the uncertainty, it was all too much. One evening, after dinner, Amara slipped into her room without a word. Jessica went to check on her, knocking lightly on the door before pushing it open. "Amara," she called softly, stepping inside. The girl was sitting at the edge of the bed, her shoulders hunched in on herself. The dim light from the Christmas tree flickered softly in the corner of the room. "Amara," Jessica said, kneeling down in front of her, "I know things are really hard right now. But you don't have to face this alone. You have us. Mike and me, we're here for you. We'll get through this together, okay?" Amara didn't respond right away. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her hands twisting in her lap. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "I don't think I can do it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't keep fighting. I don't know if I have the strength to stand up to her again." Jessica's heart ached at the words. She reached out, gently placing a hand on Amara's shoulder. "You don't have to do it all on your own. We're here. We'll help you find your strength." But Amara shook her head. "It's not just her. It's everything. I don't know where I belong anymore. I thought I did, but now, I don't even know who I am." Jessica felt a lump form in her throat, but she didn't let her emotions show. She needed to be strong for Amara. "You belong here, with us. You are not alone, Amara. You are worthy of love, and you deserve to be happy." The girl's shoulders shook, and the tears that had been threatening to spill finally did. Amara's sobs were quiet at first, but they soon became more desperate. Jessica wrapped her arms around her, holding her close, unsure of what to say but knowing she couldn't let go. The room seemed to grow smaller as the weight of the situation pressed in. Amara's cries were a release, but they were also a reminder of just how much this young girl had been through. She wasn't just fighting against Linda, she was fighting against her own fear, her own uncertainty. And the fight wasn't over. As the days passed, the legal proceedings loomed closer, and the tension between Jessica, Mike, and Amara continued to grow. They all knew what was at stake, but no one could be certain what the final outcome would be. Amara's health, both physical and emotional, was deteriorating. The weight of the decision she would have to make soon was taking its toll on her, and it was becoming clear that the court would not be able to make a decision as easily as they'd hoped. Jessica's every waking moment was spent worrying about Amara, whether she would be safe, whether she would be forced to return to the life she had left behind. The future was uncertain, and the cliffhanger of it all was unbearable. Every day was a countdown, and every moment that passed felt like a step closer to something that could change everything. Would Amara find the strength to fight for herself? Would they win the battle, or would the weight of her past continue to haunt her? No one could say for sure. All they could do was hold on to the hope that, somehow, they would be enough. The days leading up to the court hearing felt like a slow march toward an inevitable storm. Every conversation, every interaction with Amara seemed to carry an undercurrent of tension, as if they were all holding their breath, waiting for something to break. Jessica spent every waking hour preparing for what could be the most important moment of their lives. She and Mike pored over legal documents, met with social workers, and tried to reassure Amara, even as the girl pulled further into herself. The spark of hope they'd seen in her earlier was flickering, dying out little by little under the strain of the situation. Mike could see it, too. His easygoing nature had started to crack as the pressure mounted. He spent hours after work talking to lawyers and trying to figure out a way to protect Amara from the chaos that was closing in on her. But no matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they reassured her, nothing seemed to lift the weight pressing down on Amara's heart. One evening, as the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, Jessica sat in the dimly lit living room, her hands nervously clasped together. The sound of the wind against the windows was the only thing that broke the silence. Mike walked in after a long day, his face lined with exhaustion. "We're running out of time," he said, his voice flat, drained of the usual warmth. "The court date's tomorrow. They want to make a decision fast, Jessica." Jessica nodded, though the words felt like they were sinking in slow motion. Tomorrow. Everything they had fought for would come to a head, and the future, Amara's future, would be decided. The weight of it all was unbearable. "I know," Jessica whispered, her throat tight. "I just keep thinking, what if we lose? What if she's sent back to Linda?" Mike ran a hand through his hair, his eyes shadowed with the same fear. "She'll be okay, Jess. We just have to trust that we've done everything we could." But the words rang hollow. They both knew that in a system that often failed the most vulnerable, their fight was a long shot. Every part of them hoped and prayed that the court would see Amara for who she truly was, a young girl who had been torn apart by her past and desperately needed a family who cared for her. But the reality was far more complicated. As they sat there in the quiet, Jessica couldn't help but glance over at the Christmas tree. Its soft lights flickered in the corner of the room, casting a warm glow over the space. But even the comfort of the holidays seemed distant, hollow. Amara hadn't even asked to put up ornaments this year. She had stayed distant, wrapped in her own thoughts, as if the holidays had lost all meaning. In that moment, Jessica's heart broke. For the girl. How could anyone heal when their world was constantly shifting beneath their feet? Later that evening, as Jessica was about to head to bed, she found Amara sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness. The girl's face was pale, her eyes red from crying. "Amara," Jessica said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Amara didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the snow falling outside. The silence hung heavy between them, thick and suffocating. "Amara," Jessica repeated, her voice trembling slightly. She sat beside her, reaching out to place a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to go through this alone. We're with you, every step of the way." Amara turned to face her, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I don't want to go back to her. But I don't know if I can stay here either. I don't know if I belong anywhere." The words cut through Jessica like a knife. She knew that Amara's fear was deeper than anything she could see. This wasn't just about the court, this was about Amara's sense of self, her belief that she was worthy of love, that she had a place in this world. "You belong here," Jessica said fiercely, her voice full of conviction. "You belong with us. You have a family now, Amara. And we're not going anywhere. We'll fight for you." But even as she said the words, Jessica wasn't sure if they were enough. The court could take everything away in an instant. The system, despite all the good intentions, didn't always look at the heart of the matter. The next morning, the air was thick with anticipation. Jessica could barely eat, barely sleep, her nerves on edge as the clock ticked closer to the time they had to leave for the courthouse. Mike tried to keep things light, cracking jokes here and there, but even he was holding it together by a thread. As they prepared to leave, Amara came downstairs, her eyes red but determined. She had spent the morning in silence, not saying much to anyone. Jessica could see the uncertainty in her face, the battle inside her mind. "We don't have to go, you know," Jessica said softly as Amara approached, her voice laced with concern. "We'll be here for you, no matter what. You don't have to do this if you're not ready." Amara shook her head, her eyes filled with a new resolve. I have to, she said quietly. I can't let her win. I have to speak for myself. Jessica's heart swelled with pride, even as the fear gnawed at her. Amara had found something inside herself, something she didn't know she had. But Jessica also knew that this was only the beginning of the battle. They got into the car, the quiet hum of the engine the only sound filling the space. The courthouse loomed ahead, its imposing stone structure a symbol of the difficult decisions that awaited them. Every moment seemed to stretch on forever. As they entered the building, a familiar sense of dread washed over Jessica. The cold, sterile walls, the bustle of lawyers and families, nothing felt right. But there was no turning back now. They had to face whatever was coming. Amara's hand shook slightly as she reached for Jessica's. Jessica held it tight, offering her silent support. They would face this together. And then, just before they entered the courtroom, a figure appeared in the hallway, a shadow standing at the threshold. Jessica's heart skipped a beat as she saw who it was. It was Linda. And for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Linda's presence felt like a punch to the gut. She was standing there, dressed in a stiff, dark coat, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the world around Jessica and Mike seemed to fall away. The weight of Linda's gaze was sharp, intense, as if she were measuring the very core of their souls. Amara's grip on Jessica's hand tightened, and for a split second, Jessica could see the girl's shoulders tense, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Linda's cold eyes locked onto Amara, and the silence between them felt unbearable. There was a tension in the air that neither words nor gestures could break. For all the talk about family, love, and what was best for Amara, there was no question in Linda's mind that she had a claim to this child. Jessica could feel it. And she knew, deep down, that this would not be an easy fight. Amara, Linda said, her voice smooth, almost too smooth. She stepped forward, her eyes never leaving the girl, as if she were trying to draw her in with an invisible force. I see you're still with them. They've convinced you that you belong here, haven't they? Amara's face tightened. Her eyes flickered to Jessica, then back to Linda. I don't want to go back, she whispered, her voice small but resolute. Linda's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't kind, it was something darker, more calculating. You don't have a choice, sweetie. You never did. Jessica's heart thundered in her chest. She could feel the tension in the air growing thicker, heavier. But she refused to let it show. Amara has a voice now, Linda, Jessica said firmly, stepping between the two of them. She has the right to decide what's best for her. And that decision isn't yours to make. Linda's eyes narrowed, a flicker of anger flashing behind her icy facade. She stepped back slightly, as though recalculating the situation. We'll see about that, won't we, she muttered, before turning her attention back to the courtroom doors. The moment felt like an eternity, but Jessica knew they couldn't linger in this standoff forever. She glanced over at Mike, who gave her a tight, uncertain nod. Amara was still holding her hand, her knuckles white from the force of her grip. But there was a fire in her eyes, a quiet strength that made Jessica proud. They had come this far, and they weren't about to back down. They walked together into the courtroom, the sound of their footsteps echoing against the cold stone floors. As they entered, the room fell silent, all eyes turning to them. Jessica's stomach twisted in knots, but she held her head high, forcing herself to stand tall for Amara. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone settled into their seats, the judge taking his place at the bench with an air of detached authority. Linda was already seated on the other side of the room, her lawyer beside her, his gaze sharp and calculating. Jessica couldn't help but feel the weight of the battle ahead. This wasn't just about winning a case, it was about deciding who would shape Amara's future. Would it be the family who had come to love her, who had stood by her through thick and thin? Or would it be the woman who had caused so much pain in her life? The judge called the proceedings to order, his voice stern and formal. But despite the professionalism of the court, Jessica could feel everything in her gut tightening, the walls of the room closing in around them. Amara sat beside her, her body tense but her head held high. There was no sign of the shy, withdrawn girl she had been when they first met. The girl sitting beside her now was stronger, more certain of herself, even though the fear was still there, lingering just beneath the surface. As the hearing began, Jessica could see how carefully Linda and her lawyer crafted their arguments, speaking about what they thought was best for Amara. They painted a picture of a loving home, one where Amara would be cared for, provided for, and loved. But Jessica could see through the words. It wasn't about what was best for Amara, it was about control. It was about owning her, in a way that was so much more than a legal claim. Amara shifted in her seat, and Jessica could feel her tension. She glanced down at the girl, her eyes filled with worry and uncertainty. She was so young, so much of her future hung in the balance. And yet, in the quiet strength of her presence, Jessica could see that Amara was finally starting to believe in herself, in the possibility of a life where she was truly loved, where she didn't have to feel like a burden. When it was their turn to speak, Jessica stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel Mike's presence beside her, the steady anchor she had come to rely on. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "Your Honor," Jessica began, her voice steady but thick with emotion, "Amara is not just a case file. She's a person, a child who deserves to feel safe, loved, and wanted. We are here because we believe in her. We believe in who she is, and we believe that she deserves a family who will care for her, who will protect her, and who will never give up on her." Jessica paused, glancing at Amara, who was now looking up at her with wide, hopeful eyes. "We've fought for her. We've done everything in our power to give her a future. A real future. And I'm not asking for anything more than the chance to show her that love isn't just a word, it's a promise we'll keep, every day." She could feel the weight of every word, the years of struggle, the pain, and the hope all crashing together in that single moment. But it wasn't enough to sway the court just yet. Linda's lawyer was already preparing to counter, and Jessica could see the doubt creeping into Amara's expression. Just as the courtroom began to murmur with the promise of an answer soon, Jessica heard the faintest sound, the faintest rustle of papers being shifted. A small piece of evidence had been submitted. Something that would change everything. Jessica's heart skipped a beat as she caught sight of the papers in Linda's lawyer's hand. The man smiled, an expression of triumph creeping across his face as he prepared to reveal his ace in the hole. He stood up, straightened his tie, and addressed the judge with a confident tone. "Your Honor, we have new evidence that has come to light. Evidence that could significantly affect the outcome of this case." The room fell silent again, the weight of the moment settling heavily over everyone. Jessica felt a rush of adrenaline, but there was also a gnawing fear in her stomach. What could it be? What could Linda's side possibly have that could sway the court now, when they had already laid out their arguments so carefully? The judge nodded solemnly, signaling for Linda's lawyer to continue. He presented the new evidence, a set of documents that seemed to catch everyone off guard. The papers were full of legal jargon, but Jessica's eyes locked onto one line in particular. It was a statement from a social worker who had visited Amara's biological mother several months ago, a woman who had been out of the picture for years. The statement referred to a supposed change in circumstances, an alleged shift in her ability to provide a stable environment for Amara. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. Could it be? Had Linda somehow managed to orchestrate a legal maneuver that would turn everything around? The thought that Amara could be sent back to the woman who had abandoned her filled Jessica with dread. She glanced at Amara, whose expression had gone from hopeful to fearful in an instant. It was clear that she was struggling to make sense of what was happening. The judge, ever so careful, asked the lawyer to submit the documents for review, and a murmur of concern rippled through the courtroom. Mike leaned in slightly, whispering into Jessica's ear. "We need to fight this, Jess. This is not over. We've got this." But despite Mike's reassurance, Jessica could feel her confidence waver. Linda's move had caught them off guard, and there was a deep, gnawing anxiety about what it could mean. The court session continued, with the new evidence hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. Amara shifted in her seat, her fingers drumming lightly on the table in front of her. Jessica could feel her tension, the girl's unease growing with every passing minute. She reached over and gently placed a hand on Amara's, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Amara looked up at her, and for the first time in hours, Jessica saw a flicker of the girl she had come to know, the one who had once been so quiet, so closed off. Now, there was strength in her eyes, a quiet resolve. It was clear that Amara was still fighting, just as Jessica was. But Linda wasn't backing down. "Your Honor," she spoke up, her voice smooth and calculated, "this new evidence makes it clear that Amara's best chance for a stable life lies with her birth mother. The court must take into account her recent progress, her ability to now provide the care and security that this child needs. The family here has only recently become involved in Amara's life, and while their intentions may be good, they cannot replace the bond that a mother shares with her child." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as she realized just how far Linda was willing to go. She had been playing the long game, pulling all the strings behind the scenes to manipulate the situation to her advantage. The words hung in the air, leaving an eerie silence in the room. Jessica forced herself to stand tall, even though her insides felt like they were twisting into knots. She couldn't let Linda win. Not now, not after everything they had fought for. But how could they fight this new evidence? How could they possibly prove that Amara was better off with them when the very person who had caused her so much pain was suddenly painting herself as the perfect, reformed mother? She glanced at Mike again, his expression dark and determined. He knew this wasn't over either. "We'll appeal it, if we have to," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Jessica to hear. "We're not giving up. Not after all this." But what was the next move? How could they prove that Amara's life had been changed for the better with them? That the love and support they had given her outweighed the chaos and instability of her biological mother's life? The clock seemed to drag on as Linda's lawyer made his closing argument, but Jessica could hardly focus on the words anymore. All she could think about was Amara. She turned to the girl once more, her heart swelling with love and worry in equal measure. Amara had come so far. She had found herself here, in this family that had accepted her with open arms, that had loved her unconditionally. Could the court really send her back into the unknown? The judge finally called for a recess, his voice slicing through the tension like a knife. "We will reconvene tomorrow to discuss the new evidence and make a decision." As the court emptied out, Jessica and Mike stood together, Amara between them. There was a quiet sense of urgency in the air, but also a deep sadness. No one spoke as they left the courtroom, the weight of the day hanging heavily over them. But in that silence, one thing was certain: tomorrow would bring the hardest battle they had ever faced. And they would have to fight it together. The following day, the atmosphere in the courtroom was even more intense. The air felt thick with anticipation, each person on edge, waiting for the judge's decision. Jessica, Mike, and Amara had arrived early, sitting quietly in the back, each lost in their thoughts, bracing themselves for what was to come. The weight of the situation was heavy on all of them. The looming decision seemed like a massive wall they had to scale, but the fear of falling back down was almost unbearable. Amara fidgeted nervously, tapping her fingers against her lap. Jessica squeezed her hand, trying to offer some comfort, but she could feel the trembling of Amara's small fingers in return. Mike leaned closer, whispering softly, "It's not over yet, Jess. We'll make it through." But Jessica wasn't so sure anymore. After the shocking revelation of Linda's evidence, the world seemed to shift beneath their feet. It wasn't just a fight for custody now, it felt like a battle for Amara's future, one that could spiral out of their control at any moment. As they waited for the judge to arrive, the courtroom doors swung open unexpectedly. A tall figure in a suit strode in with a purpose, Linda's lawyer. But this time, there was someone else with him. Someone who Jessica had never expected to see in this court. A woman, tall and wearing a black coat, walked confidently beside Linda's lawyer, her face somewhat familiar but not entirely clear. The woman's presence felt like a shadow over everything, as if a storm was suddenly closing in. Jessica narrowed her eyes, trying to place the woman's face. She was sure she had seen her before, but where? Her gaze flicked to Mike, who noticed her unease. "Who is that?" Jessica whispered urgently. Mike looked over, then froze. His face paled as recognition slowly dawned on him. That's Amara's birth mother." The words hit Jessica like a ton of bricks. Her heart skipped a beat, the room around her starting to blur. This was the last person she ever expected to see. After all these years of silence, she had reappeared just when everything seemed so close to being settled. The woman was tall, with deep-set eyes and a weary, almost haunted expression. Her movements were deliberate, her presence unnerving. Jessica felt her stomach twist. What was she doing here? Hadn't Linda already won the argument for her? Why was Amara's biological mother suddenly involved? Mike's voice was barely a whisper, thick with disbelief. She wasn't supposed to show up. Not after everything. Jessica's mind raced, trying to make sense of the sudden twist. Amara's birth mother, who had disappeared from her life years ago, was now standing in the very same room, aligned with Linda, as if nothing had happened. It was as if the past had come back to haunt them all in the most unexpected way. Amara shifted uncomfortably beside Jessica, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She had been through so much already. What was going to happen now? Would she have to face this woman, the one who had once abandoned her? The courtroom seemed to close in on them, the sound of whispers rising around the room. Jessica's throat tightened as she watched the woman and Linda's lawyer walk up to the judge's bench, their conversation too quiet to be heard over the low murmur of the crowd. But then, Jessica's heart stopped as the woman stepped forward and, with a firm voice, said something that froze her blood. "I want to take my daughter back." It was as though the ground beneath Jessica's feet had crumbled. The room went dead silent. All eyes turned toward the woman, whose words had shattered the fragile hope that had been hanging in the air. She was claiming Amara. She was trying to take her back after everything, after years of neglect. The shock of it all was too much to process in the moment. How could this be happening? How could the woman who had abandoned her child so easily now claim to be the one who could provide a stable home? Jessica's mind was racing, every thought colliding with another. She had been fighting for Amara's future, for a future where she was loved, safe, and cherished. But now, it felt as though that future was slipping through her fingers. Could this woman truly offer what Amara needed? Was there a chance she had changed, had become someone worthy of being a mother again? Linda's lawyer stood confidently, backing up the woman's statement, claiming that she was now in a position to offer a home filled with love and stability. He even pointed to the recent documents as evidence of the woman's progress, painting a picture of someone who had turned their life around. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. Was this the end of everything they had fought for? Was this how it all ended? With Amara being returned to the very person who had caused her so much pain? Amara, clearly sensing the rising tension, looked up at Jessica with wide, fearful eyes. "Are they going to take me away?" she asked, her voice small and trembling. Jessica's heart shattered at the sight of her fear. She didn't know how to answer. How could she explain this to Amara? How could she possibly give her the strength she needed when Jessica was feeling so helpless herself? The judge, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "I will need time to review all of the evidence presented here today. The court will recess until further notice." With those words, the gavel came down, signaling the break in the proceedings. But the room didn't feel like a break, it felt like the calm before an inevitable storm. Jessica stood frozen, staring at Amara, trying to find something to say, something to offer that would ease her worries. But nothing seemed enough in this moment. How could they face what was coming? And in that moment, everything was uncertain. Would the court rule in favor of the woman who had returned after years of silence? Or would they honor the love and care that Jessica and Mike had given Amara, a love that had helped her heal, to finally feel safe and seen? The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The real battle was just beginning. The courtroom buzzed with a low hum as the recess began, but to Jessica, it felt like an eternity. The uncertainty hung heavy in the air, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. She turned to look at Mike, his face pale and tense, his hands tightly gripping the armrests of his chair as if trying to anchor himself to some semblance of stability. But there was no stability to be found. Not now, not here. Amara sat beside Jessica, her small hand grasping hers with desperate intensity. Her eyes were wide, filled with confusion and fear. "What happens now, Mama?" she asked, her voice cracking with the vulnerability of a child who had just had her entire world upended. Jessica's heart broke at the question. She had always promised Amara that she would protect her, that she would never let anything bad happen to her again. But now, she wasn't sure how to keep that promise. What if the court sided with the woman who had reappeared after all these years? What if Amara was taken from her, from the only family she had ever known? "I don't know, sweetie," Jessica whispered, brushing a stray lock of hair from Amara's forehead. "But I'll fight for you. Always." Mike shifted in his seat, looking over at Linda's lawyer and the mysterious woman who had claimed to be Amara's birth mother. He could feel the tension in the room, could sense that the battle was far from over. But there was something about the woman's presence that unsettled him. It wasn't just the shock of her sudden arrival, it was the way she carried herself, as if she knew something they didn't, as if she held all the answers to a question they hadn't even asked yet. "I don't like this," Mike muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he studied the woman. "Something doesn't feel right. Why show up now, after all this time?" Jessica shook her head, unsure of what to think. She had no answers, only the deep fear gnawing at her insides. There had to be a reason for her sudden appearance. But why now? Why when they were so close to the finish line? The judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom, signaling the end of the recess. The air felt thicker, more charged, as if everyone knew the moment of truth was finally arriving. Jessica stood, her legs shaky beneath her, and helped Amara to her feet. They walked back to their seats, their hearts pounding in their chests as they prepared to face whatever would come next. The judge returned to the bench, his face stern and unreadable. He motioned for everyone to sit, and the room fell silent, the anticipation palpable. Jessica could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, their gaze like a weight on her shoulders. She could almost hear the ticking of the clock, counting down to the moment when the judge would speak, when everything would change. The judge cleared his throat, his voice carrying through the room. "After careful consideration of the evidence presented, including the new testimony from the respondent's biological mother, I have decided that a more thorough investigation is required before a final ruling can be made." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. A more thorough investigation? What did that mean? Was this just a delay, or did it mean the judge was still uncertain about the case? The judge continued. I am assigning a guardian ad litem to conduct an independent evaluation of the situation, focusing on the best interests of the child. This investigation will include interviews with both the petitioner and the respondent, as well as a review of all relevant documentation. I expect a report to be submitted within 2 weeks. Until then, the court will reconvene to determine the next steps. Jessica's head was spinning as the judge's words sank in. The decision had been deferred. The tension in the room didn't ease, though. If anything, it became even more palpable. 2 weeks felt like a lifetime, and every day would stretch the uncertainty even further. Would this investigation reveal something new, something they hadn't anticipated? Or would it merely prolong the agony, the waiting, the fear? As the courtroom began to empty, Jessica and Mike exchanged a look, one filled with a mixture of frustration, anxiety, and determination. This wasn't over. Not yet. Amara tugged at Jessica's sleeve, her voice small and unsure. "Mama, what does this mean? Does this mean they're not taking me away?" Jessica crouched down, looking her daughter in the eye. "No, sweetie, they're not taking you away. Not yet. But we have to wait for the investigation. We have to be patient. I know it's scary, but we'll get through this together." Amara nodded, but Jessica could see the doubt lingering in her eyes. She couldn't protect her from this, she couldn't shield her from the fear and the uncertainty. But she could fight, she could hold on, and she could show Amara that no matter what, they were in this together. The weight of the coming weeks hung over them as they walked out of the courthouse, the cold air hitting their faces like a reminder of everything that was at stake. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something else was lurking beneath the surface, something they hadn't uncovered yet. The woman, Amara's birth mother, hadn't just reappeared for no reason. She had a plan, a purpose. And Jessica needed to figure out what that was before it was too late. For now, though, there was nothing more they could do except wait. But Jessica knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't stop fighting. Not for Amara. Not for the family they had built together. As the days dragged on, Jessica's mind raced. Every conversation with Mike, every visit to the lawyer's office, every passing moment made her more certain that there was more to this story than she had been told. The investigation would bring answers, but it also felt like it would unearth new complications, new twists they weren't prepared for. And so they waited, each day a slow march toward an uncertain future, with the looming question: would they be able to keep Amara, or would she be taken from them? The 2 weeks dragged by like an endless stretch of gray sky, each day heavier than the last. Jessica had hoped for clarity, for some sense of resolution, but as the deadline drew near, all she could feel was the relentless pressure building. She didn't know what she was expecting from the investigation, but the weight had become unbearable. Amara's fears had grown with each passing day, and even the comforting routine of their home no longer felt like a sanctuary. The uncertainty hung over them, like a shadow that refused to leave. Finally, the day arrived. Jessica sat in the small conference room at her lawyer's office, Mike beside her, both of them staring at the clock as the minutes ticked by. The anticipation felt suffocating. When the door opened, it wasn't the lawyer who entered but a familiar face, Linda, the woman who had started all of this. Jessica's stomach dropped as she saw Linda's face, her eyes cold and determined. Without a word, Linda sat down, a folder in her hands. The moment stretched between them, thick with tension. Jessica could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she refused to let it show. Mike's hand gripped hers tightly, a silent signal that they were in this together, no matter what happened next. The lawyer soon followed, his expression unreadable. He didn't waste time with pleasantries, getting straight to the point. "The guardian ad litem has completed her evaluation," he said, opening the folder. "After speaking with both parties and reviewing all the relevant information, she's made a recommendation." Jessica held her breath, her eyes fixed on the lawyer's face. The room seemed to close in on her as he continued. "The recommendation is clear," he said, his voice steady. "Amara will stay with Jessica. The evidence of the bond between mother and child is undeniable. The emotional stability that Jessica provides is far more conducive to Amara's well-being than what Linda can offer." Jessica exhaled, but the relief didn't come as expected. She felt numb, like the weight of the situation had frozen her in place. Mike squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of their victory. But there was something else in the air, something that felt off, a sense that this wasn't the end. Linda's face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "This isn't over," she said, her voice sharp. "I have the right to appeal. I won't stop until I get what's mine." Jessica didn't respond. She knew Linda was determined, but the battle had taken its toll. She had won this fight, but the war wasn't over. The fear of Linda's return, the thought of Amara being torn away, lingered in her mind like an unspoken threat. As they walked out of the office, Jessica felt the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. The fight had been long, and while this victory was sweet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. What had driven Linda to do this? What had she wanted all along? They drove home in silence, Amara in the back seat, her small face pressed against the window as the city passed by. Jessica couldn't stop thinking about Linda's words. "I won't stop until I get what's mine." What did that mean? What else could she be hiding? As they pulled into the driveway, Jessica's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her stomach dropping as she saw an unfamiliar number. "Hello," she answered cautiously. "Jessica, it's me," the voice on the other end said, familiar but unexpected. It was Linda's lawyer. "I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but there's been a development." Her heart skipped a beat. "What development?" she asked, the words barely able to leave her lips. "I know this is going to sound strange, but after further investigation, we've uncovered something that might change the outcome of the case." Jessica felt her world tilt. "What do you mean? What could possibly change it?" The lawyer sighed, his voice heavy. "Linda isn't actually Amara's biological mother." The words hit Jessica like a physical blow. She felt the ground shift beneath her, her mind racing to process the information. "Excuse me?" Jessica's voice cracked. "What do you mean? How is that even possible?" "We've just found out that Linda had been deceived," the lawyer continued. "She wasn't aware, but Amara was switched at birth. The woman who claimed to be her mother, well, she's the real mother. Linda's DNA doesn't match Amara's at all." Jessica's mind spun, struggling to grasp what she was hearing. "So, who is Amara's real mother?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't say yet," the lawyer replied. "But we'll need to go through the proper channels. I know this is a shock, but you need to be prepared for more than just Linda. There's more to this story than we initially thought." The phone call ended, and Jessica stood frozen, her breath coming in short gasps. Mike looked at her, concern written all over his face. "What is it?" he asked, his voice urgent. "What did they say?" They're telling me that Amara's not Linda's daughter," Jessica whispered, her mind still reeling. "She's someone else's." The revelation crashed over them like a tidal wave. The truth, so unexpected, shattered everything they had known. The woman who had threatened to take Amara away wasn't even her biological mother. The entire case, the entire fight, had been based on a lie. Jessica looked at Amara, her heart aching. The child she had raised, the little girl who had called her mama for so long, was she really hers? Was she even truly hers in the way she had thought? And if not, who was? Jessica's mind raced, her thoughts swirling with confusion and disbelief. She stood motionless, staring at Amara, who was sitting on the living room floor, drawing with crayons, her small fingers expertly guiding the colorful pieces across the paper. The sound of the crayon scraping against the surface was the only noise in the room, yet it felt deafening, as though everything was closing in on Jessica, suffocating her with its weight. Who is she?" Jessica whispered to herself, the words barely escaping her lips. She could hardly process what she had just learned. How could Linda have been so wrong? How had she not known? Jessica had trusted the system, trusted everything that had led her to believe that Amara was hers, that she had a right to raise this beautiful child. But now, that belief was shattering. Mike stepped closer to her, his voice gentle but firm. "Jess, we need to stay calm. We'll get through this. We'll find out who she is, and we'll make sure Amara is safe. We can handle this, I know we can." Jessica didn't respond. She couldn't. The only thing that mattered was the child who had given her so much joy, the child who had filled her life with laughter, love, and all the warmth of a family she had worked so hard to build. How could this be real? How could the world suddenly shift beneath her feet? Amara looked up from her drawing, sensing the tension in the room. Her wide, innocent eyes locked onto Jessica's, and for a brief moment, everything stopped. There was a silence, almost sacred, between them. Amara didn't understand the storm brewing around her, but Jessica could see the trust in her gaze, the trust of a child who had known no other mother. "Mom?" Amara asked softly, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you okay?" Jessica swallowed hard, trying to choke back the tears that had begun to form in her eyes. She forced a smile, but it felt like the weakest thing she had ever done. "Yeah, sweetie," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm okay. I need to think for a moment, okay?" Amara nodded, her face returning to the paper, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that her world was breaking apart. What did this mean for Amara? Who were her real parents, and why had they never come forward before? Why hadn't they found her sooner? The room felt stifling now, and Jessica couldn't stand the silence any longer. She needed answers. She needed to talk to the lawyer again, to demand more clarity, to understand what had happened. But she also couldn't ignore the truth that Amara was still the girl who had called her mom for years. The bond they had shared didn't change, no matter who her biological mother was. Jessica had loved her from the moment she saw her, and that love would not fade, no matter what secrets had been buried in the past. "Mike, I need to call them again," Jessica said, her voice strained. "We need to get to the bottom of this. I need to know who her real mother is." Mike nodded, his brow furrowed with concern. "I understand. I'm with you, Jess. But just, be careful. We don't know what we're dealing with yet." As Jessica stepped away to make the call, her thoughts continued to spiral. Who was this woman that had raised Amara? Why hadn't she come looking for her daughter? Was there some kind of tragic misunderstanding? Was it really just a mix-up at the hospital, or was there something more sinister at play? The phone call felt like an eternity. When the lawyer finally answered, Jessica could hear the hesitation in his voice. "Jessica, I know this is a lot to process, but I need you to stay calm. We've found the records of the woman who is Amara's biological mother. Her name is Maria Davis, and we've confirmed she had been unaware of the mix-up until recently. I'm sending you the details now." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. Maria Davis. The name felt so strange, like it belonged to someone else, to a world she had never been a part of. Who was this woman? Was she out there, somewhere, looking for her child? And if so, what was she planning to do? The lawyer continued, his voice cutting through Jessica's racing thoughts. "I know this is overwhelming, but you need to prepare yourself. Amara might have some questions soon, and we don't have all the answers yet. But I promise, we're doing everything we can to keep her safe. Jessica's hands trembled as she ended the call, the weight of the news settling heavily in her chest. She looked at Mike, who had been standing by her side the entire time, waiting for the next move. "We need to find Maria," Jessica said, her voice raw with emotion. "I need to know who she is. I need to know what she wants with Amara." Mike's expression was grim, but his resolve was unwavering. "We'll figure this out, Jess. But no matter what happens, Amara is still our daughter. That's something no one can take away from us." Jessica didn't know how to respond. She was filled with so many conflicting emotions: fear, anger, confusion. She didn't know how to protect Amara from a truth she couldn't yet understand, nor how to explain to the child who had trusted her with her love and affection for so long. How could she prepare Amara for the storm that was coming? As night fell, Jessica sat in the quiet of the living room, Amara asleep beside her. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a place of uncertainty. Everything she had worked so hard for, the love she had given, the family they had built, was hanging by a thread. And somewhere, out there, Maria Davis was still a mystery. Would she come to claim Amara as her own? Would Jessica be forced to hand over the child she had raised, the child who had been everything to her? The tension of the unknown was unbearable, and Jessica knew that the next chapter of their lives was about to unfold in ways she could never have anticipated. The storm was only beginning. As the days passed, Jessica found herself living in a state of constant tension. Each moment felt like it was leading toward an inevitable confrontation with Maria Davis, the woman whose name had shaken everything Jessica believed to be true about her family. She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her gut that this was more than just a mix-up. It felt like a story that had been buried too long, waiting to come to the surface. But through all the uncertainty, Jessica had one unwavering belief: Amara was her daughter, no matter what the records said. Mike was equally determined to stand by her side. Every step of the way, he had been her anchor, keeping her grounded when the world felt as though it were spinning out of control. Together, they began to prepare for whatever the future might bring, knowing that they couldn't let the past define who they were now, or what they meant to Amara. Then, one afternoon, the phone rang. It was the lawyer again, but this time, there was something different in his voice, something that told Jessica this call might be the one that finally brought clarity. She quickly picked up, her heart pounding in her chest. "Jessica," the lawyer began, "we've found Maria. She wants to meet with you." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Maria Davis, Amara's biological mother, had finally come forward. But what did that mean? Was this the beginning of the end for everything Jessica had known, or was it a chance to heal the wounds of the past? Jessica glanced over at Mike, who had been waiting for her response. She could see the worry etched in his features, but also the resolve. He nodded subtly, offering her the silent support she needed. "When and where?" Jessica asked, trying to steady her voice. "We've arranged for you to meet at the law office tomorrow morning," the lawyer replied. "Maria is ready to talk. She seems to want to explain everything, but I can't say much more than that right now." The conversation ended, and Jessica felt a mix of emotions: relief, dread, anticipation, and uncertainty. What would she find when she met Maria? Would this woman be kind and understanding, or would she be angry, demanding, or distant? No matter what, Jessica knew she couldn't allow herself to be blindsided. She needed answers, and she needed to protect Amara. The next morning, Jessica and Mike drove to the law office in silence. The city around them seemed oblivious to the storm brewing in their lives, with people walking to work, enjoying their mornings, unaware of the intense journey Jessica and her family were on. As they pulled up to the office, Jessica's nerves were on edge. She hadn't known what to expect, but she had prepared herself for the worst. They walked into the office together, and a few minutes later, they were led into a small, sterile conference room. Across from them, seated at the table, was Maria Davis. She was a woman in her early 30s, with soft brown eyes and a tired expression, as if life had weighed heavily on her. Jessica couldn't help but wonder what had brought her here, after all these years of silence. Maria stood when they entered, her hand trembling slightly as she extended it toward Jessica. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said softly, her voice carrying an edge of vulnerability. "I know this is hard, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I want to explain. I need you to understand." Jessica shook her hand, feeling a strange mix of emotions. There was a part of her that wanted to scream, to demand answers right then and there, but another part knew that they needed to take this step, to hear what Maria had to say. She nodded, her voice steady. "Please, sit down. Let's talk." Maria sat back down, and for a long moment, there was an uncomfortable silence. Then, finally, Maria spoke. "I was young when I had Amara," she began, her voice quiet, almost apologetic. "I didn't have a stable life. I was in a bad place, and I didn't know what to do. I was told by the hospital that there had been a mix-up with the paperwork. They said my daughter had been adopted out, that she was going to a good family, and I didn't ask any questions. I just wanted to move on with my life." Jessica listened carefully, trying to absorb the weight of Maria's words. It was a story of neglect, of decisions made out of fear, and the deep, painful consequences of those choices. She could understand how someone could make mistakes, but it didn't change the fact that Jessica had raised Amara for years. Maria continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But then, when I heard about the adoption mix-up, I tried to find her. I didn't know where to look. I didn't know if I had any rights left. And then I found out that you were raising her. I just couldn't believe it. All these years, I thought she was lost, and now I've seen her, and I don't want to take her away from you. I just want to know her. I want to be a part of her life, but I don't want to hurt her or you." The weight of Maria's confession hit Jessica like a tidal wave. She could see the regret in the woman's eyes, but also the yearning, a deep, desperate longing to reconnect with the daughter she had lost. And yet, as much as Jessica could empathize, there was a part of her that felt protective. She had raised Amara, loved her, and built a life with her. This wasn't something that could be taken away. "I understand," Jessica said, her voice surprisingly calm. "I know this is difficult for you, but Amara is my daughter. I love her with everything I have, and that's not something that's going to change." Maria nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't want to cause any pain. I just want to know her, to be a part of her life. I don't want her to grow up thinking she has no roots. I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt anyone." There was a long pause, and Jessica felt the weight of the decision she was about to make. She knew this wasn't going to be an easy road. There would be no easy answers, no quick fixes. But there was something in Maria's words that spoke to her, something that reminded her of the deep, unspoken bond between a mother and her child. "We'll figure this out," Jessica said finally, her voice filled with determination. "We'll work together, but Amara's home is with us. And that's where she'll stay. But if you want to be a part of her life, we'll find a way to make that happen. Slowly. Carefully. For her sake." Maria nodded, wiping her eyes. "Thank you. Thank you for being willing to let me in, even just a little." Jessica stood up, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't the resolution she had expected, but it was a step forward, toward healing, toward understanding, toward making sure Amara grew up with love, support, and the truth. As they left the office, walking side by side in silence, Jessica realized that no matter what the future held, her family was strong. Amara's place in her heart would never change. The love that bound them together was more than just a matter of blood, It was a matter of shared experiences, of laughter, of struggles, and of a commitment to each other that nothing, not even time, could erase. The storm had passed. The road ahead would still be uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Jessica felt the hope of a new beginning, one where both the past and the future could coexist, and where love would always be the guiding force. As the days rolled by, Jessica found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. The meeting with Maria had been an emotional turning point, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter, one that would require patience, trust, and above all, love. Amara was her daughter, and no matter the complexities of the situation, nothing could change that fundamental truth. The holidays came and went, and with each passing day, Jessica and Mike worked together to slowly, but steadily, incorporate Maria into their lives. They knew it wouldn't be easy, and at times, it was difficult to balance the feelings of a mother's love with the reality of a biological connection. But they took it one step at a time, always considering what was best for Amara. Maria respected their boundaries, understanding that building a relationship with her daughter would take time. There were moments of joy, laughter, and even some tears, but in the end, Jessica could see that both Maria and Amara were beginning to build something new, a bond, albeit different from what Jessica had imagined. They weren't replacing each other. Instead, they were adding layers to the fabric of Amara's life, giving her the opportunity to know the full breadth of her history, her roots, and the love that surrounded her. It wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about creating a future, one that embraced all the parts of Amara's story and allowed her to grow in a home filled with love and support from both her biological mother and the parents who had raised her. The tension that had clouded Jessica's heart for so long began to lift, replaced by a quiet understanding. She had feared losing Amara, but instead, she had gained something unexpected, a new chapter, one where there was space for both the family she had created and the family that had been there before. By the time spring arrived, things had settled into a rhythm. Amara spent time with Maria, but she also knew where her home was, where her heart truly belonged. Jessica and Mike continued to provide the stability, love, and guidance that had always been there, while Maria gently stepped into the role of a mother who had missed so much, but who was determined to make up for lost time. One afternoon, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jessica and Amara sat together in the living room, the Christmas tree still standing proudly in the corner, its twinkling lights a reminder of the journey they had been on. Amara had just finished drawing a picture of a family, each figure filled with colors, and at the center was a heart. "You know, Mom," Amara said, her voice thoughtful, "I think I finally get it. You're my mom. And Maria, she's like a friend. A family friend." Jessica smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Yes, sweetheart. That's right. And no matter what, we're all a part of your family. Nothing can change that." Amara hugged her tightly, a silent promise between them. They were stronger now, stronger together. Jessica looked over at Mike, who was standing in the doorway, his eyes soft with emotion. He gave her a small nod, one that said everything without words. They had made it through the storm. They had weathered the uncertainty, the fear, and the questions. And now, they stood at the other side, together. And as they all gathered around the table for dinner that evening, their hearts full, Jessica realized that family wasn't just about blood. It was about love, sacrifice, and the willingness to open your heart to those who truly matter. It was about building a future, with room for everyone who mattered, no matter how unexpected the journey might be. In the end, it wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about finding a way to make that truth work in the most loving, compassionate way possible. Jessica had found her peace. Amara had found her family. And they had found each other, in a way they could never have imagined before. The story wasn't over, but it was beginning again. And for Jessica, Mike, and Amara, that was all that mattered.